I'm back, and we're finally working into this piece. Stay tuned for the highs and lows, along with the story of what happened to a few of the women who originally worked Mountmellick and where they disappeared to. With everything now ready, it's time to start the actual stitching. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intimidated by the sheer scale of this project. I'm not really sure what I was thinking when I designed it, but I was definitely inspired by this 10-foot wedding quilt in the Mountmellick Museum. The scale of that piece gave me a sense of awe, and I think Mountmellick suits larger scale projects. However, my eyes may have been bigger than my theoretical stomach on this one. You'll see. I finally did it and sprang for some traditional Mountmellick thread. I chose the biggest size and I only got the one because it was expensive. It feels different to any other thread I've worked with before. It's sort of coarse. You can tell it's somewhat untreated. The best I can compare it to is a thread off an old towel that's been washed loads of times. It's rough and really absorbent. I like that it feels like it wants to felt. It gives me some hope that my woven in ends might actually have a chance of staying in place this time. I thought this project would take me a week. Could you imagine? The hubris of that. I started recording this process before I'd even put out the video on designing the piece. Oops, but it's coming along nicely. Well, actually, I don't think it looks as good as the smaller one, but I may have some plans to correct that. One of the major issues is this cotton. It's so cheap and flimsy. The thread especially makes a holy show out of it, but it's what we have, so it's what we're rolling with. To stop the thread from losing its twist, I'm working with lengths that are no longer than the distance between my fingertips to my elbow. This thread has an S twist instead of a Z twist. It's plied in a certain direction, so it twists a certain way, and I'm working with the thread instead of wrestling against it to give me a decent chance of keeping the twist as I work. I'm looking at this footage and my nails are so long that it's kind of hard for me to pick up needles and thread them. Don't worry, the struggle won't last for long. There was an incident involving the fourth nail on my right hand. I'm still in mourning, so I won't speak further on it. Just know that I'm raging. At the end of day 3, this piece looks awful, but I'm not ripping out and starting over. And here's why. I'm learning, so it's going to be terrible, probably. I also have 3 more of these panels to go, and I hope I'll see an improvement in each one. I'm sorry it's sloppy and tangled, but if I stay here and unpick again and again, I'll just never move on. So if I do enough of this, I figure I'll get lucky and churn out a decent piece eventually. One of the reasons this looks so ratty is these little knots. Let's talk about them. They're starting knots. They do something. You think because you have a strain injury and you're not knitting, you're exempt from weaving in ends. But you're wrong. You will be weaving in ends until the day you die. There's no escape. Maybe I was clever and got some footage of me weaving in some of the ends of the thread. I did the ends as I went. But the starting knots are dealt with like this. The knot is cut and I'm using a tiny crochet hook to weave in the threads into the work on the other side. Mountmellick is really opposed to knots on the back, so this is apparently how they did it. I will say it's a lot better than the last time, where the work unravelled under my fingers as I went because I didn't do any knots at all. I also never overlocked the edges of this because I never got my sewing machine out. Please don't judge me. A brief overview of the plan for this piece and what I'm up to in the footage. The sweet peas running up the side will form the border of the design. Their interlocking stems are meant to invoke a Celtic feeling. They'll be done with a stem stitch on each side. The sweet peas will have little swirly bits coming off the sides of them. I first tried these out in a split back stitch, but then switched over to a coral stitch instead for both variety and texture, and to give them a lighter feeling than the big stems. The small leaves are done in a fishbone stitch, just to fill them in and suggest where the middle part of the leaf is. The flowers are filled in with a buttonhole, which I really struggled with at first. The ridged edge of the buttonhole is where the edge of the leaf would be. Their stems are a simple backstitch. The big lily at the bottom has more stem stitch for the outside of the leaves and backstitch for the details within. The stems and buds are lightly padded satin stitch. The pollen parts of the lily are whip stem and bullions. I'm starting to realise there's loads of work to be done, and I don't want you to be staring at hours of footage of me doing the same thing over and over again, so I'll be incorporating some history into these videos. When I started my research journey, I thought I'd be learning about stitches, but the history of Mountmellick is woven into the fabric of Irish social history. I'm not a history buff, I didn't take it in school, I like prehistory, but it all got very boring for me once guns were invented. And Irish history is particularly miserable. It's all famine this and failed revolution that. So when I say the stories surrounding this seemingly stiff and boring lace practice are some of the most fascinating I've ever come across, you may believe me. If you're a 20-something in Ireland, chances are you've thought about emigrating, maybe to Australia. This isn't a new concept. Young people in Ireland have always been emigrating to Australia since at least 1848, though not always by choice. In 1839, Ireland started setting up workhouses for its poor people under the 1839 Poor Law Act. 130 workhouses were built in Ireland that came up just in time for the famine to hit. I won't get into what caused the famine here, but in case you didn't know, it was a massive event in Irish history. Before, the population of Ireland was around 8.5 million people. They reckon 1 million people starved to death and another million emigrated. But those that emigrated didn't just disappear, they went somewhere. And this is the story of a few of those people. Irish people were mainly emigrating to Canada and America, but a few of them were going to Australia. There's a few factors as to why people weren't going out to Oz as much, but we can guess that the journey was longer and rougher, and it was just generally further away. Under the penal laws, criminals in Ireland and England were being sent there, so it didn't have the glamorous reputation it enjoys today. In order to get people to go south, someone you may have heard of came up with a bright idea. Charles Grey wasn't only famous for tea. Before he was a delicious cup of Earl Grey tea, he was in fact the Prime Minister of the UK. He was facing a problem in Ireland. These peasants were filling up his workhouses and annoying his landlords by being too destitute to pay rent or farm. He also faced another issue in Australia, where there was a distinct shortage of wives for the men out there to marry. So he devised the Earl Grey scheme to solve two birds with one stone. From 1848, the people of Ireland were relying heavily on workhouses and soup kitchens to survive. Unlike modern CE schemes, these workhouses were known as the most feared and hated institutions ever established in Ireland. The work was hard and overcrowding was rife. The workhouse in Mountmellick got its first inmates in 1845. It was built to house 800, but it housed up to 1,600 people there during the worst of it. The subject of the workhouses and the altruistic acts of the town of Mountmellick are beyond the scope of this video, but this particular workhouse was one that caught the eye of Earl Grey. The Earl Grey scheme was as follows. The workhouses would volunteer girls between the ages of 14 to 19 to take part in the scheme. These girls were chosen by a few criteria. They were healthy, or at least healthy looking, well behaved and able to be educated. They were selected for both their aesthetics and their skill. They would then educate these women in essential skills you'd need to run a home back then, including embroidery. This is where Mountmellick lace gets its passport to go travelling far beyond the town of Laois where it originated. They would be given a wooden box full of the essentials: clothes, shoes, a Bible and a needle and thread. Now remember that for some of these girls, they'd never even owned shoes before, so this was like winning the lotto. Let's talk about the boats. Between the years of 1848 and 1850, 4,114 Irish girls were transported to Australia under this scheme. Unlike the coffin ships headed to America and Canada, these women were paid for by the UK state per head to arrive in Australia. So there was doctors, teachers, matrons and cooks on board for them to keep them during their journey. 68 of these women came from Abbeylee and Mountmellick on these ships. And if you're watching this trying to hunt down an ancestor, I've some good news for you. There's records of these women on the Mountmellick Museum website. Mountmellick Museum even found 2 of these women and is now telling their stories in their excellent exhibition. I can't recommend it enough. Now if you're that Irish 20-something we discussed earlier, hiya, glad you're still here. You've probably seen the following story post on Instagram. A contact of yours in front of Sydney Opera House taking a selfie in the blistering sun and a caption of Oz, let's be having ya. I have some disappointing news. This is not a modern invention either. The women aboard these ships rode home to their guilds and workhouses on landing. They were optimistic about their futures and had glowing praise of the scheme. To the women back home, it was a coin flip. Stay in the workhouse in rainy Ireland or sign up for the scheme and take their chances in Australia. To many, the Earl Grey scheme seemed like the lesser of two evils. Unfortunately, just like an Instagram story doesn't show 3 weeks later in Sydney, when you're out of money and sunburned, these letters weren't the whole truth either. Many of these women were exploited or treated cruelly in their new lives in Australia. The scheme was discontinued in 1850 because the men in Australia were moaning about not wanting Irish wives or Catholic wives or ugly wives or bad wives. This ended the paperwork that went along with the scheme, and so the women that went on to have happy lives have disappeared from the record. The ones who persist in public record are the ones reporting their bosses or husbands to the police. I can't tell the stories of all these women, but I encourage you to look them up if you're interested. The only one I'll include here is Mary Miller, who travelled on the Tip o' Sib on the 29th of July 1850. Her story persists through her children and grandchildren. Here's a picture of her with her daughter, granddaughter and great-granddaughter. More about her story can be found on the Mountmellick Museum website. The women who made this journey had both good and bad stories, but according to the museum, 20% of Australian people today can trace their descendants to these original 4,000 women from Ireland. So the next time you pick up a needle and thread, remember that you are connected to a long line of women in the past who did the same thing and have experiences just as rich and real as your own. Now back to the project. This took so long. I started this in October and it's now January. The piece is also huge. I wrote the scale down when I was planning it out, but it's a really different beast in the flesh. It's really, really massive. So with as much of the design done on these panels as I can do, it's time to bring them together and sew them through the middle. I'll match the patterns together to create a seam guide, then off camera I'll tack them together to make sure they're straight. At that stage I took a ruler to these and measured the distance from the pattern to the edge of each side in the middle to make sure the designs were as symmetrical as I could get them. The plan is now to embroider the middle of the pattern over the seam, a technique from the wedding quilt in the Mountmellick Museum. So now all I have to do is repeat the same thing again for the other end of the runner, but hopefully it won't take 4 months this time.